So if you would like to turn your video off, you're more than welcome to. You don't need to have your video on in order to see Sara and her presentation. And if you would prefer that for privacy reasons, please go and stop video now if you would like to do that. Okay, so I think that's all from me. I'm going to hand over to Tali, who's going to introduce Sara to everybody.
Hi everyone. As people coming in, and they're coming in from everywhere in the world, and it's really wonderfully exciting to see everyone, let me introduce myself. My name is Tali Nates. I am the director of the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, and we have here in this wonderful webinar many friends, colleagues, of course, dear Sara Brown, a friend and a colleague that agreed to share her knowledge with us today, and also colleagues from our sister centers, from the Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center and the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center, as well as many members, friends from, as I said, from around the world. Today is a special day. It is, of course, the 25th of May, 2020, and today is Africa Day. It actually marks the 57th anniversary of Africa Day. The first one was celebrated in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia. But of course, today's day is slightly different. We are, of course, today, all or almost all of us still in lockdown. Still at home because, of course, of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it is a very, very, very different way of celebrating unity, of celebrating the achievements of Africa, but also remembering some of the darker times in the continent. And one of them, of course, is the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. As a center of memory, education, dialogue, and lessons for humanity, we continue to teach, even during this very difficult time, about the Holocaust and, of course, genocide. But more than ever, we find that we are called to focus our attention on human rights abuses, and specifically at xenophobia and anti-Semitism that are sadly on the rise today. We also continue to focus on the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, as this is still the 100 days of memory that we, of course, started all together on the 7th of April this year, and it will end sometime in July, the 4th or the 5th of July. We are especially keen to learn more, I think now, after the capture of Felician Kabuga and all the news surrounding all that story coming fast and furious every day. And today's topic, of course, sits really well alongside that very topical lesson. Lessons from genocide about resilience and social activism are very important nowadays, and learning from Sara, a friend and a colleague, as I said before, about women who were upstanders, who were rescuers and resistors, alongside those that were perpetrators, is very important to us today. And Dr. Sara Brown will share with us her research on locating women's agency during the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. Just to introduce Sara Brown to you officially, Dr. Sara E. Brown is the Executive Director of the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights and Genocide Education at Brookdale Community College in New Jersey, the United States. Brown holds the first Ph.D. in comparative genocide studies from Clark University's Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies. She's the author of Gender and the Genocide in Rwanda, Women as Perpetrators and Rescuers. And now it is an open access text, and I call all of you to download it. I certainly did, and read this excellent, excellent book. And she's also the co-editor of the forthcoming Routledge Handbook on Religion and Genocide. And we saw each other last in person last year in July in Cambodia, because Dr. Brown is also very, very much involved in the IAGS, the International Association of Genocide Scholars. It is really an honor and a pleasure to welcome you, and we are looking forward to learn from you, Sara.
Thank you, Tali. I'm going to share my screen now so that everyone is able to see my PowerPoint. Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining me today for the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center webinar in honor of Africa Day. My name is Sara Brown, and I'm the Executive Director of Change with 2 H's. That stands for the Center for Holocaust, Human Rights, and Genocide Education, located in New Jersey, which is just across the pond from all of you, or most of you. I hope each of you is well and healthy and safe. Thank you, Tali. Thank you, Kath. Thank you to the volunteers and the staff at the center for hosting me today. It is so, so important that you continue your work educating, advocating, and remembering, even during these very unusual and difficult times. Also, thanks to everyone else for being here. It's important that you're present and you're celebrating this day virtually this time. So today we are going to discuss the role of women during the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda. And I'd like to start with a story. Several years ago, I sat in a living room in eastern Rwanda interviewing Ilana and Amanda. Their names have been changed. Ilana opened with her story. As a Hutu, she was safe from the Interahamwe when the 1994 genocide began. And as a woman, she was mostly ignored by the majority men gangs of perpetrators who made their rounds every morning, recruiting able-bodied sons and husbands to participate in the genocide. Alana could have spent those months at home and on her farm, tending to her family, tending to her crops, essentially removed from but not completely heedless of the genocide that was taking place outside of her compound. She could have chosen, in effect, to be a bystander. Instead, she ventured to a nearby hill to check on her friend, who is a Tutsi, Amanda. She found Amanda at home with her 5 children and her badly beaten husband. When the Interahamwe showed up again soon after Alana had arrived and took Amanda's husband, Alana wasted no time. She begged Amanda to come with her, and when Amanda refused, Alana grabbed the children and she fled. Amanda eventually made her way to Alana's home, but only after she saw her husband murdered. Together, the women devised a plan to rescue Amanda and her children. And Alana's husband returned home later that day to find the household doubled in size and his wife determined. She said to him, "We are going to stay the way we are. We are not going to give them out. They are going to stay with us, and if they decide to kill them, then they'll kill all of us together." After several harrowing months, the RPF liberated their village. Alana, Amanda, and their families all survived the genocide. Their stories are incredible and could fill an entire memoir. But when I asked the women why I'd never heard of them before, they shrugged. Nobody ever asked. Now, I am very appreciative of the fact that I am speaking to such a knowledgeable audience. I am going to briefly repeat an overview of the genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda, just to make sure that we're all on the same page before I start discussing the particulars of my findings. The genocide against the Tutsi in Rwanda began on the evening of April 6th with the assassination of then President Juvenal Habyarimana. By April 7th, the official date of commemoration, when the 100 days that Tali was referring to began, people woke up, Rwandans woke up, particularly in Kigali, the capital city, to roadblocks and lists of people being distributed via radio and in person, and killings taking place across the city. Those killings eventually spread throughout the country over the ensuing 100 days. over 1 million individuals, Tutsis and Hutu moderates, were systematically hunted, tortured, raped, and murdered as part of an orchestrated genocide. Despite the presence of United Nations peacekeeping forces stationed in Kigali, the genocide continued unabated and without international interference. It was only stopped by the RPF, which eventually took control of the country. Rwandans then began a lengthy reconstruction and rehabilitation process that continues even to this day. My research, which is now my book, Gender and the Genocide in Rwanda, set out to compare and contrast the agency and actions of women rescuers and perpetrators during the 1994 genocide. To tell this story, I foregrounded the experiences of women. I collected and analyzed over 77 interviews, the majority of whom were from women, and dozens more from other organizations, allowing their stories to be told in their own words. I came to this topic because something about my visits to Rwanda did not sit well with me. I first traveled to Rwanda in 2004. Every time I went, I heard similar refrains. Women were victims or bystanders, men were rescuers or perpetrators, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something in there was missing. Despite extensive documentation, the role of women, an elemental component of the genocide in Rwanda, I later found out, is rarely mentioned in the popular narrative. So I set out to explore and analyze the central role played by these women who exercised agency either as rescuers or as perpetrators during the genocide. And this approach and some of my findings fill a gap that existed in the scholarship and the literature about Rwanda, but often generated outside of Rwanda. The scholarly community, and this is when I'm speaking about this community in particular, and there's this robust and wonderful scholarly community taking place that's in Rwanda, and they're also correcting this narrative, but the scholarly community outside of Rwanda, largely in North America and Europe, with a few notable exceptions, they unfortunately perpetuate an interpretation of conflict that denies women a role in the violence aside from that of victim or bystander. And this limited literary real estate that is afforded to women during the genocide in Rwanda ends up stymieing a more nuanced examination of their experiences. They're given this finite amount of space, right, in the narrative, and so their stories have been simplified or ignored. As a result of a combination of these and specific gendered processes that are particular to Rwandan culture, the full scope of agency exhibited by women rescuers and perpetrators during the genocide in Rwanda has gone uncharted, along with how that agency was performed, because there are certain restrictions that were there, and also what types of constraints were in place. And while there is a degree of acceptance of women's agency during the genocide within Rwanda's borders, it is sometimes balanced by a perception of the essentialized woman according to local gender norms. So I set out to examine this monolithic narrative and offer a more complicated and sometimes, for some, uncomfortable analysis of women during the genocide. And my research started with some very basic questions that were inspired by a tremendous scholar named Cynthia Enlow. I asked the question, where are the women? It was very basic, very straightforward. Where are the women? And then I started counting them. And then I started asking, and what were they doing? And then I let the women do the talking, shedding light on their own agency, their own thinking, their own feelings, and their own behavior before, during, and after the genocide in Rwanda. Now, just a spoiler alert, here's what I found. During the genocide, Rwandan women took actions and decisions within the context of a deeply entrenched patriarchal system that limited and restricted their ability to act. And across the board, genocide narratives traditionally do cast women as victims. And I must stress that many women in Rwanda did suffer horrific abuses and become victims of torture in Rwanda. But this characterization of women is inaccurate and incomplete. Just briefly, before I get into the particulars, what do I mean by agency? Agency is a tricky term. So women's agency, for the purposes of this discussion, is understood as acts of compliance with or resistance against the dominant, violent social structure of the time. And often these actions were undertaken at great personal risk to self and family. Now, this definition does not imply that there weren't other avenues for action during the genocide. For example, bystanders chose not to act, and victims exercised incredible agency despite their tremendously limited options. Additionally, in 1994, Rwanda, and it's a stark contrast to how Rwanda is today, but I have to note this, that women exercised a gender-specific form of agency. Rwandan women in 1994 were not allowed to inherit property. They couldn't open a bank account without the written consent of their husband. And representing just 5% of the executive branch of government, they were not in a political position to be advocating for change or for their own rights. As such, the women in 1994 exercised an admittedly limited form of agency, operating within a deeply entrenched patriarchal system. So I conducted my research. I was based on oral histories, the majority of which came from women, and these were to capture the women's voices and shed light on their agency, their thinking, their feeling. And today I'll share with you a brief overview of some of the findings based on their words. I'm going to focus on 3 core questions. The first one is, how and why were certain Rwandan women mobilized to participate in the genocide, and by whom? The second question is, what were the specific actions of women who exercised agency during this period of violence and upheaval? And then the last question, what happened to them after the genocide? What were their trajectories? Were rescuers hailed as heroes and perpetrators brought to justice? Now, together, we're going to compare and contrast how women rescuers and perpetrators were mobilized, the actions they undertook, and their post-genocide trajectories. And then if we have time at the end, someone please ask me the question how this impacts Rwanda post-conflict, the reconstruction and rehabilitation processes. First things first, this deeply entrenched patriarchal system that I talked about, that was existent, it was present in 1994, pre-genocide Rwanda, it limited women's agencies and it was pervasive. It was both in the public sphere and in the private sphere, and it was even enshrined in law. There was a law that identified men as the legal head of the household. And these all combined to ensure that women were second-class citizens within their own state. Now, as a result, when women were mobilized to participate in genocidal violence in 1994, we need to know that the strategies that were employed appealed to their gendered and subordinate status in society. One of the key areas that I want to focus on is the role of media. And this has received a lot of attention in scholarship, but also in the popular narrative. But I want to explore it from a gendered lens. So the first one I want to show to you is this cartoon that was published in Kangura. It was a mouthpiece for Hutu extremists. And there you see an image of then General Romeo Dallaire, the head of the UN peacekeeping forces stationed in Rwanda, in charge of overseeing the implementation of the 1993 Arusha Accords, a peace treaty between the RPF rebels and the Hutu government led by Habyarimana. And he's in charge of overseeing this peace accord, and this cartoon depicts him being seduced by 2 Tutsi women who are dressed very provocatively and behaving in a very sexual manner. And he, in the corner, you can see, is being guarded by a Belgian peacekeeping officer. Here, the caption, it's in Kinyarwanda, but the rough English translation is that General Dallaire and his army have fallen into the trap of Tutsi femme fatales. Now, the idea here with this cartoon was to depict Tutsi women as a particularly nefarious and evil, ethnic, and also sexual other. So they're not just Tutsis, they're Tutsi women, and they are somehow using their sexual power, their prowess, their promiscuity, which, by the way, in Rwandan culture, which at the time and it continues to prize modesty and chastity, this was a further dehumanizing tool, and it was a further abhorrent activity. Here they're depicting the Tutsi woman as particularly nefarious, particularly evil, particularly at risk. And my interpretation of this is also to highlight the risk, not just to broader society, but also to Hutu women. Then there is the Hutu 10 Commandments, published in 1990. The first 3 commandments, and these are the ones that I want to focus on, there were 10 commandments in total, and it is no surprise that in a population, among the population in Rwanda, over 90% of the population was Christian at the time of the genocide. And it is incredibly impactful to publish something known as commandments, harking towards the 10 commandments present in the Old Testament. This is a deliberate ploy to stress the importance of these 10 commandments, which all dictated behaviors that were required of a good Hutu ethnic community member. Now, the first 3 are incredibly important because they each contain mobilizing rhetoric aimed specifically at women or about women. So here's the first commandment, which you can see on the screen. It identifies Tutsi women as a threat to the Hutu cause and was intended to further dehumanize this subsect of the Tutsi population, the Tutsi woman, and identify them as particularly inhuman and evil and a threat, a them in an us versus them paradigm. So this builds upon the cartoon that I showed to you before. The second commandment praises the virtues of Hutu women and offers a positive identification for the us group, not just Hutus, but more specifically Hutu women. And it's interesting to note, it doesn't note them as leaders in the community, right? They're good secretaries and wives and mothers. So it's still appealing to them in their gendered role in society, but building up that positive us identification. And then there's the third commandment. And the third commandment's really interesting because here it encourages Hutu women to be vigilant and try to make their men see reason. This, in a way, sanctions the agency and actions of women who up until now were socially and culturally restricted from standing up to a man. This was not done in Rwandan culture. And here there's the third commandment. So, you know, the first 3 in the Old Testament are particularly significant. Here's the third one telling women to bring your husbands to reason. This is, in a way, revolutionary. Now, another key agent for mobilization that is often discussed in the scholarship about the genocide in Rwanda is RTLM radio, Radio de Mille. This was another mouthpiece for the Hutu extremists. And oftentimes the content, the songs, the kind of barroom chat that they would simulate in the radio broadcast, this is all focused upon as ways that they built up hatred against Tutsis, fear of Hutus, and mobilized the community to participate in genocide. But it's interesting to note that one of the more popular radio broadcasters, both among men and women alike, was Valerie Bemeriki. Now, she is one of the few women who gained entry into the male-dominated public sphere of radio. And Bemeriki ended up becoming a role model for Hutu women. She also was a galvanizing force for Hutu men who did not want to appear to be, quote, leading from behind or following after her lead when she would call for them to take action, be vigilant, be mindful, and she used a variety of euphemisms calling people to violence. I actually interviewed her, and I want to note that she was very quick to hedge and assert that yes, she said a lot of things, but that she could not tell someone to do something that they didn't already want to do. So she tried to downplay herself as a mobilizing agent. It's also interesting to note that national political leaders played a key role in mobilizing people to participate in the genocide, but maybe less so with women. One of the things that I found is that women in particular were less knowledgeable of national dynamics and more oriented around their local hill. So more frequently, when I would ask them, what were you hearing before the genocide, they would reference things like what they heard on the radio, what they heard in the market, what they heard from their local Interahamwe militia leaders, what they heard from their school teachers, their church leaders. They didn't really reference national figures. So for me, this finding was important because I note that the leadership that influenced them was decidedly more local. Another thing I want to note is that fear was pervasive, and it was essential to mobilizing women to participate. And across the board, women rescuers, women perpetrators, and women survivors, they all noted the shouting, the running, gunfire, killing, fear, chaos. All of these were experienced and shared when I would ask them what was going on in the lead up to the genocide and during the genocide. But there's a key difference here. There's a key difference between women rescuers, and women perpetrators. Both groups were exposed to the same mobilization, and they spoke of the fear, the terror, the anxiety. But women rescuers rejected these efforts to stoke up that fear and catalyze action against the Tutsis. They did not give in to it. Alana, one of the heroine that I mentioned above in my earlier story, she shared with me how she mastered her fear. She said, at some point, I realized that fear is not the solution, got over it, and was like, whatever happens will happen, but as long as I have a right to move freely, I'm going to do what I can to save whom I can. After seeing the kind of killings that were happening, I wasn't afraid anymore. I would stand and protect those I have in my house. Now, while each experience was unique, there are certain common themes that emerged among women rescuers. And these include a capacity to think critically about and eventually reject the messages of hatred that they were receiving via print publications, via the radio, and from their local leadership, and possibly even within their home. They were more apt to think for themselves rather than to follow the words of others. Or they would even reject their leaders, instead relying on lessons that they learned from their family. And then there were still others like Alana who followed the teachings of her faith. Another unexpected, but maybe not unsurprising factor, although I was surprised at first, I'm no longer surprised, was the absence of a male head of house in the majority of the homes that rescued. I interviewed 16 women rescuers, and 9 of the 16 women rescuers did not have a male spouse at home during the genocide. Now, it appears that this influenced their capacity to rescue, as they were not subject, according to both law and custom, to the authority of a man. Though I will note that, Alana's husband enthusiastically rescued with her. So it's not the case that every man would have said no and gotten in the way of a woman being able to rescue. It just seems to be an interesting trend. Now, women perpetrators are a little more complicated, and I'll get into this in more detail, but one thing I must note is that I cannot confirm what I initially expected, that women perpetrators embraced the mobilization efforts of extremists around them. It's actually difficult to say, as the majority of the women perpetrators I interviewed denied their participation in the genocide, and with it, the mobilization efforts that would have catalyzed their involvement in the first place, although some would have also self-mobilized. This did surprise me, as prior studies of men perpetrators have often revealed a willingness, or in some kind of almost disturbing instances, an eagerness on the part of men to detail their crimes. In contrast, women perpetrators were reticent to admit their crimes, and with those crimes, their mobilization. And I'll talk a little bit more about that momentarily. Now, when it comes to the actions undertaken and experiences during genocide, I do want to note that on the whole, women rescuers and women perpetrators alike, they could have chosen to be bystanders to the violence. They did not. Rescue included acts of direct assistance, both large and small. And women rescuers knowingly faced great challenges and terrifying risks. Still, they rescued. It was mind-blowing to hear their awareness of the fact that, yes, they could be killed, yes, their family members could be killed, and yet still they decided to take direct action, small, both large and small. Successful rescue, like the story of Alana and Amanda, often hinged on chance encounters, good fortune, or unlikely situations. And failed attempts were frequent. One of the rescuers that I interviewed, in fact, failed and lost the person that she was trying to save. Local knowledge was a significant factor that contributed often to successful rescue. And that local knowledge could stem from knowledge of the terrain and appropriate routes, by the way, for flight. So, knowing that if you take this path, it will lead you directly past the home of a local Interahamwe leader. So skip that one and go this way instead. So basic information like that, but also knowledge of spiritual practices and superstitions often would help in facilitate the saving of lives. In certain instances, even sexism saved lives. If a woman was the head of the household, they were, first of all, less likely to suffer daily visits from the Interahamwe because they were in search of predominantly male recruits and generally spared their indoctrination. In other instances, there are certain gendered perceptions of the private domestic space in Rwanda that saved women from searches in their home or in certain parts of their home. An example I have is a woman who rescued several individuals by hiding them in her kitchen because when the Interahamwe militia came to search her home, it didn't even occur to them, an all-men group, to go to the kitchen because that was a woman's space. Other women benefited from sexist perceptions that underestimated, ignored, or diminished them. In one instance, I interviewed a woman who rescued a baby, and that infant was just a few days old when she found her, and she was also nursing a child at the time, and so she nursed both of them. When the local Interahamwe heard that she had rescued a baby, they came to investigate and to kill the child and possibly to harm her. And instead they walked up, and she was a very frail woman, very thin, and they laughed at her and they mocked her and said that your breasts don't have enough milk for both of these children, and so your punishment is that both your child and this other child will die. That is your punishment. And I'm happy to report that both children are alive and well and thriving. Now, what motivated these women? I'll repeat a little bit of what I was saying before in the mobilization section. I heard repeated references to morality and shared humanity. In addition, for many of them, religion served as a primary catalyst. One woman referred to it as the cross that she was chosen to bear. Others referenced their maternity and popular gendered notions around motherhood. And still others rescued because of friendship or intergenerational learning, having observed their parents or even their grandparents before them rescue in prior episodes of violence in Rwanda. Now, on the other hand, I want to point out one key finding that may appear obvious, but I just want to stress it, that the women perpetrators I met were by and large ordinary people. They did not display symptoms of psychopathy. I interviewed in the end 25 women perpetrators, and by and large, absolutely average, ordinary, normal people. And though many women perpetrators describe the genocidal environment as one that continued to be dominated by men, women perpetrators actually represent a much larger number than was previously estimated soon after the genocide was over. Initially, there were about 3,000 women that were incarcerated or suspected of having participated in the genocide, and that was the number that the scholarly community outside of Rwanda worked with. Now, I have new data, but I just want to note that this data will continue to evolve to reflect growing research in this area, and that's wonderful. That's a great sign of a marker of change. But for now, I will share with you some information based on the 2012 report at the closing of the Gacaca courts and the following data. So, of the 1,003,227 suspects tried by the Gacaca courts, 96,653 were women, representing nearly 10% of everyone brought to dock. That is significantly larger than the 3,000 initially estimated. And I do want to note that there are acquittal rates and that there are other numbers there, but I just want to flag that number. Nearly 10% of everyone brought to dock suspected of genocide-related crimes. Nearly 10% were women. Now, the majority of the women I interviewed participated in acts of indirect crimes that did not necessarily include physical force. But I want to note that of that 10% of suspected perpetrators brought to dock, that some did murder and some raped. Though I will note that just one male survivor of woman perpetrated rape would speak with me. And I suspect that this actually is due to a stigma that emasculates and isolates men victimized by rape, and not because it did not occur. Now, Bemariki, who is featured predominantly on this slide, she is our radio broadcaster that I mentioned before. She was with RTLM radio throughout this period, working to reassure listeners that the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, the Tutsi rebels, were to blame for the violence and the unrest, and to imbue the extremist leadership with this feigned victimhood. On May 17th of 1994, she transmitted the following message. She said, "All the people who were killed in the country are the victims of the RPF. It is the cockroach Inkotani," which Inkotani at the time was a derogatory term for the RPF rebel group, "who have killed them and nobody else. That is why the Presidential Guard should not be disbanded, and this was the private military force of Habyarimana. It did nothing wrong. That is why the government should not be dissolved. It was legally set up and did not carry out any killings. It was rather set up to establish the security that the RPF had troubled." Now, here is a classic example of someone denying a genocide is even taking place as it is occurring. And if anyone is familiar with the 10 stages of genocide, which was, it's been published by a number of scholars, but the one that I often refer to is the one by Gregory Stanton. One of the 10 stages of genocide that is present in every instance of modern genocide that we have studied is denial. And denial often doesn't wait until the end of the genocide or after the genocide to begin. Denial is often taking place from the very outset. In the very planning stages, denial is a present component. And Bemariki was one of those individuals who helped to set up the euphemisms to hide the actual violence and horror that was taking place. She was one of the individuals to implicate the RPF and blame the Tutsis for their own demise. She was one of the first to start denying from the beginning and spreading misinformation about what was taking place in Rwanda. Now, and denial is a pressing issue for me, because as I mentioned before, an issue that I faced was that of the many women that I interviewed, most of them denied their participation. In the end, 22 of 26 total, 25 category 2 perpetrators and 1 category 1 perpetrator whom I interviewed, denied their involvement, even though they had confessed to either the Gacaca courts or the national courts. Some of the women I interviewed even argued that as women, they were incapable of participating, relying on these gendered tropes about women as pacifists or being unable to commit crimes. So I randomly sampled 9 women and compared their interviews that I had with them, so the interviews that I had taken of them, and I compared it with the Gacaca court transcripts, and I found that at least 7 had substantial inconsistencies. It is my belief that the women misrepresented their stories to me. But why? They'd already been found guilty. They were already serving their time. Why lie to me? Why misrepresent their stories to me? And my theory is this has to do with gendered interpretations of women's participation in violence as unacceptable, and therefore cause for shame, and along with that shame, especially among the perpetrators, denial. I also want to note that there was an interesting formula that emerged over the course of my interviews. The less forthcoming the woman perpetrator was with me in her interviews, so the less forthcoming she was about the crimes, what she had been tried for in Gacaca, what she had been convicted and found guilty of, what she had confessed to. So the less forthcoming she was, the less remorse she expressed, and the more she emphasized her own personal suffering and loss when I would ask towards the end of the interview, "What is it that you regret?" Now, by and large, women went unnoticed in the immediate post-genocide period in Rwanda. While the successful gender mainstreaming initiatives in Rwanda have resulted in tremendous gains for women, including the first women's majority parliament in the world, Rwanda still grapples with the role of women in society and in history. The immediate post-genocide reality was chaotic. The RPF established a unity government, and the international community helped to some extent, more so after 1996. Combined, the government and the international community both shared a blind spot, a gendered blind spot, when it came to women who did not fit the common narrative of bystander or victim. As a result, many of the women perpetrators rejoined society and resumed their lives and their work as though they had committed no crime. Life went back to normal for these women until the repercussions of this gender-based impunity by attrition culture was eventually recognized as subversive, and the Gacaca courts were established. Many women perpetrators whom I interviewed actually recalled being surprised when they were called before the courts and charged, many of them over a decade later. So Gacaca courts, really went nationwide. The pilot starts in 2004. They go nationwide in 2006. Many of these women, it's been over a decade, and all of a sudden they're being called to dock and to speak for, in light of allegations made against them that they had participated in the genocide. Some of these women had even made their way to the United States and established new lives despite their participation in the genocide. And I stress that because on the title page of my talk, you would have seen a cartoon rendering, a sketch. It's a courtroom sketch. And that courtroom sketch is of a woman named Beatrice Munyenyezi, who moved to the United States and had set up a full life, had been here nearly a decade, much more than a decade, I'm sorry. She'd raised all three of her children here before she was investigated by the government here in the United States on allegations that she had participated in the genocide and misrepresented herself in her immigration paperwork. And it took 2 federal court cases, not one. The first one was a mistrial. They struggled with the idea of a woman being such and a pregnant woman being such a fierce perpetrator. But the second court case, she was found guilty. She's now serving a sentence and will eventually likely be extradited to Rwanda, where she is wanted for crimes of genocide. But they even made their way as far as the United States. In contrast, the marginalization of rescuers remains a challenge in Rwanda, and we still don't know how many there are. While a desire for justice produced a mechanism for identifying genocide perpetrators, very little woman or manpower or funds have been dedicated to identifying rescuers. There was one tremendous study that was done by Ibuka in Rwanda, but they ran out of funds after surveying just 14% of the provinces. And although some efforts have been undertaken to acknowledge and reward women rescuers, including 3 of the women that I happened to interview, they often experience a continuum of violence that is evident in the disruption of their everyday life, often displacement, in some instances continued insecurity, and also the silence is buried. I was surprised to learn that some women rescuers continue to hide their acts for fear of retribution or alienation. And others were unable to do so after the genocide and faced violent repercussions. Some had to relocate and hide their identity. Others lost property that was destroyed in retribution for their participating in rescue. And still others have fallen into a tense routine with their neighbors that may not include direct acts of violence, but does include regular verbal abuse and ostracization. Still others face jealousy and accusations of hidden wealth due to the isolated efforts of the government and some survivor organizations to reward a few of the rescuers. And some other women remain impoverished, due in part to bribes that they paid to the Interahamwe in order to save those whom they were hiding. For example, when I spoke with Amanda and Alana, despite Amanda's poverty, when I asked if Alana should be recognized for rescuing her and her children, she exclaimed to me, "What can I say to that question? It's obvious. I wish I could have a cow to give to her really as a gift of appreciating the act that she did." Now, Alana has never been recognized or rewarded by the local officials in her area, but she did note to me that one of her rewards was the continued friendship of Amanda. They are thick as thieves. Now, of note, women rescuers who lived alone were more likely to report feeling unsafe. And I want to go back to the fact that 9 of the 16 women that I interviewed, 9 of the 16 women rescuers that I interviewed, did not have a male head of house in the home during the genocide. So this is an important finding for me, that many of the women rescuers who continued to live alone were more likely to feel unsafe. This intersection of sex and security was key to several of the women who assessed their safety according to the absence or presence of a man in their household. And several of the women who shared the dual identity of rescuer and survivor faced even further compounded risks. And I want to note that all of this is in spite of the fact that Rwanda has made tremendous gains. If you look at the 2 images in front of you on the screen, one is of the unfortunately late but unbelievable woman leader Aloysia Nyumba, who brought about, catalyzed so much positive change in gender mainstreaming in Rwanda. And then you also can see a march where you see women are agents of change and activism and advocacy now in Rwanda in ways that they were never before. Now, I'm coming towards the end of my time, so I want to note that there are some long-term and concerning implications here that are worth unpacking, but I want to be mindful of my time and conclude. Rwandan women stand on the fault lines of Rwanda's reconstruction and rehabilitation efforts. And while the successful gender mainstreaming initiatives in Rwanda have resulted in so much positive change, Rwanda is still grappling with the role of women during the genocide. And so too is the international community as they work and develop policies to help Rwanda in its reconstruction and rehabilitation efforts. Women did play a significant role during the genocide in Rwanda, both as rescuers and as perpetrators. Though there are these gendered assumptions about women's agency and actions that force them often into the background of the mainstream narrative. Though fewer in number than the men who acted during the genocide, and often marginalized socially and economically within Rwandan society even today, the women who exercised agency during the genocide continue to impact the country. And this complicated story, grounded in women's histories as told by women, is absolutely necessary. It's needed for good scholarship. It is needed to document, learn from, and prevent mass violence. And it is needed to understand Rwandan women, their identities, their personhood, and their narrative. And so with that, I want to open it to questions and thank all of you for participating. My thank you page includes an image of our center. If you ever make your way to New Jersey, you are more than welcome. We would love to host you once we reopen. And I'll turn it over to Tali and Kath. Thank you.
Sara, thank you so much for a really fascinating presentation. Thank you for deepening and broadening our knowledge of the role of women during the genocide that took place in Rwanda, but especially giving us so many interesting and varied examples and stories that we will, I think, hold on to and use in our own teaching of the subject. So thank you very, very much for your time. So now I'd like to invite anybody who has a question to please either write your question in the chat or raise your hand or indicate to us that you have something to ask, and we will try and facilitate that.
And also from my side, Sarah, just a great thank you. So maybe if you will stop sharing, we will see the grid and then see more hands raised. Thank you.
There you go. Thanks.
So, I will invite everyone, if you want to change the grid from speaker view to general view, it's on your top right hand side. And if you want to raise a hand, you can do that if your video is on. And if your video is off, there are other ways to do the hand if Kath wants to speak about that.
Okay, if you go to manage participants at the bottom of your page, you'll get a list of participants on the right hand side, and there you should be able to find a way. I think if you click on more, you should be able to raise your hand, and we will see that immediately on the participants list.
So let's start maybe with the first comment and question from Simone Horowitz. She's saying, thank you, Sarah, for a fascinating and important talk. My question, you spoke about the perpetrators not speaking openly to you. Could that have something to do with your positionality as a white foreign academic? From my own experience with oral histories, this is something I often grapple with.
Not to plug the book, but it is open access, so I gain nothing by you downloading it, and so I will plug the book. But in my text, Gender and the Genocide in Rwanda, I talk about this at length because you are 100% correct. My positionality as a white woman, as a foreign academic, also the identity of my my translator. I worked with the same translator across the board with the exception of just a few interviews where I brought in a man to translate. And when there were on occasion, someone would identify her as possibly Tutsi, and the whole demeanor would change, the behavior would change. In one instance, one of the interviews that we conducted, she was openly threatened. And so, yes, my identity certainly had an impact, and then the identity or perceived identity of my translator also had an impact. One of the things that I worked very hard to overcome, and there is no overcoming it, but I tried to at least mitigate or be mindful of it, was that I would open with that. I always had a script with me. After I would explain who I was, I would give them a rather detailed, and I'm a little slightly bit more introverted as a person, but I would give this very open biography of my story, where I came from, where my family was from. I gave this very detailed background to kind of humanize myself and also make myself additionally vulnerable. I would leave plenty of time before the interview even got started, before they even gave their permissions, for them to ask me any question under the sun. And often I'll note that this period of exchange and back and forth and getting to know one another was often longer than the interview. And with that, I tried very hard to mitigate and own some of these issues, but they are certainly, I think they're a key component. I flew to Rwanda multiple times with this expectation that I would have these easy flowing conversations, kind of similar to like Scott Strassler, who did such tremendous work on men perpetrators. And he seemed to just walk into a prison and they would line up to tell him stories of what they'd done. And as I kept encountering the same resistance, not in just one camp, because it's one thing if maybe the women are speaking among themselves, that's entirely possible. But when it was across 7 different camps around the country and in a prison, I started to realize, no, there's actually something larger here, and started unpacking this idea that maybe there's also a sense of what is acceptable for a woman to have done during the genocide. And I think that too had an impact. But certainly my identity, which is something that I cannot change, I think it also played a role.
Thank you. Maybe I will ask a question while people are thinking and we are catching the hands. A few things. You spoke about the role of women then. Can you reflect a little bit about the changes, because there have been many changes, a little bit of the changes in the last 26 years? Where are women today in Rwanda? Maybe a little bit about, because you did comparative genocides, I'm quite interested that if you're looking, let's say, at Holocaust women perpetrators or rescuers, did you find some, can you reflect on some similarities? I can already sort of somewhere in my head, some similarities about rescuers being acknowledged and being afraid of neighbors and other things that pop into my mind.
2 excellent questions. The role of women today in Rwanda is such an incredible story, because oftentimes when episodes of mass violence occur, they create these fissures, these breaks in the normal tapestry that weaves together society. And into those spaces, into those breaks, come areas where women can exercise new agency. The fact that women were even able to participate in any way at all in the genocide in Rwanda did represent a change in women's access to public spheres. The fact that they were brought on and mobilized to participate is, in a way, revolutionary. Normally, after an episode of violence, though, those openings, those spaces where women come in to inhabit, those close. And in Rwanda, that was not the case. And I think a lot of that had to do with the leadership that came in and established the national unity government. Because there were so many women leaders who already were playing a key role in the RPF, the Rwandan Patriotic Front, they went on to inhabit leadership positions when they came in to govern Rwanda. So I always think of two women in particular whom I had the great honor of interviewing. One is the late Aloysia Nyumba, who went on to, she inhabited so many positions. She was a senator, she was a member of parliament, she was the mayor of Kigali, she was a minister, she just inhabited all of these key leadership roles. And I remember interviewing her in 2011 and her talking about the fact that women in key leadership roles were the first instance of collaboration across ethnic divides post-genocide. And one of the first initiatives that they collaborated on was there was a very high number of children who were minors who did not have heads of household anymore. They were orphaned. And dealing with the issue of tens of thousands, even possibly over 100,000 orphans, was one of the first things that galvanized women, Hutu women and Tutsi women, to work together and solve. And over, women became the advocates of innovative thinking, collaboration, and working together towards common goals, and that was a very key component. But there were also other women leaders like Rose Kabuye, who was the first mayor of Kigali after the genocide. Now, she was a different figure. She was a military figure. She was, I think she was a captain in the RPF. And when she was assigned to be the mayor, one of the first questions I asked her was, did you face any gender-based discrimination? And she started laughing at me. And she said, I was a captain in the military. These people, when I walked into the room, they knew I wasn't coming to play. And I always remember that in her bearing and in the way that she just even scoffed at my suggestion, therein lay an answer too, because she left no room for that. She left no space for that. And over, I heard stories of women leaning down and bringing up young women leaders, you know, at the very smallest level, the cell level in Rwandan governments, all the way up to ministerial posts. They also played a key role in the construction of the drafting of a new constitution, which ensured that at least 30% of all leadership roles, appointed leadership roles, would be inhabited by women. They were the ones who advocated to their political parties to make sure that enough women were on the ticket when they ran for government. And so over and over, it seems that Rwanda has taken really full steam ahead this idea of gender mainstreaming, and that women, a complementary approach between men and women leaders working together, but also across ethnic divides towards common goals, really is the future, and a constructive future. So that, I mean, today, look, when Rwanda became the first country in the world, not one of the Scandinavian countries, which I think everybody expects, but when Rwanda became the first country in the world to elect a women's majority parliament, there's the proof. Right? The gender mainstream approaches that they initiated worked. And I think that it really is a great example of how women can both lean in, but also lean down and bring up others, but also find ways to work collaboratively, even in the instance of a genocide, which would have, you would think, created this tremendous gap between Hutu women and Tutsi women. They forged ahead because they knew they had to work together, because they did not have the option of leaving the country. So rebuilding meant not being able to leave. Now, in the Jewish narrative, after the Holocaust, most of the survivors were able to exit Europe, or were forced really to exit Europe. So it's a very different story. But I do often think about, as I did my research, I really started thinking about similarities between women during the Holocaust, women perpetrators in particular during the Holocaust, and women perpetrators during the genocide in Rwanda. I actually just wrote a comparative piece about it that was published in the Journal of Perpetrator Research. And one of the things that I found was that across the board, the similarities are alarming and prevalent. So even in the pre-genocide patriarchal construct of each of the instances. And there are decades and continents that divide these two case studies. But you also see in pre-Holocaust Germany a very rigid patriarchal society, but you see that they are making all of these promises to women and mobilizing them, again, as almost second-class citizens, but encouraging them to play a role in all women's auxiliary groups, in Nazi-designated groups that are tightly controlled and very rigid, but they're also still an opportunity for women to get outside of their homes and engage in activism in a way that they hadn't before. Wendy Lauer wrote a tremendous book in which you see that women were, as social workers and educators and secretaries, that they were encouraged to move east to help the Nazi cause and to work for the Reich. And so many of them did this in order to flee just bored lives or forced marriage or, you know, the confines of a small village living. There's gender-based mobilization happening there, but you also see it in the perpetration. You see it also in the post-genocide silence and obscurity. The fact that most of the women were able to fade into the woodwork and the background of the narrative of the Holocaust. It's very similar to what happened in Rwanda. And you do also see that if were not for the Gacaca Accords, this gendered blind spot would have been shared. I mean, for the ICTR, the UN-based ad hoc court for the genocide in Rwanda, just one woman was found guilty of genocide, just one. So yes, there are similarities there.
We've got lots of questions.
A number of questions came up, so I'm going to turn, Kath, I'll rely on you to moderate.
We've got a number of questions, but Carl Nell has been waiting very patiently to ask his question. So I'm going to ask Carl to just unmute yourself and you can put your question directly to Sara.
Thank you very much. Sara, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
All right. Oh, super. Thank you very much for the presentation. It's just a two-part question. The one was there was a project that ran out of funding and I didn't get the name of it. I just needed to know who started that project, what that was all about, and then I can ask my main question.
So that was run by Ibuka, IBUKA, and that's an umbrella organization for a number of survivor groups and organizations in Rwanda. They were the ones that spearheaded this study years ago. I want to say maybe 8 years ago. And they actually used the same criteria as Yad Vashem and the Righteous Among the Gentiles as the basis for their search for rescuers in Rwanda. And they made it through about 14% of the provinces before they ran out of funds. But it was, I mean, it's an incredible study, and it really was what spurred me to start examining and searching for women rescuers.
Okay, so now the main question. I'm speaking as an IB teacher in training, and the IB places a lot of emphasis on international mindedness and so on. If those organizations are going to run out of funding, or if there's so much opposition in countries where this kind of thing happens, that it is only Western, quote unquote, organizations and individuals who are passionate about this, who end up doing the kind of excellent work that you're doing, isn't it a bit unfair to play that you're a foreigner card, or you're a Westerner card, or you're a white woman card? You know what, whereas I'm perfectly aware of the limitations that can impose on one's ability to work with certain sources. To make that a mechanism for excluding or preventing certain projects in a world where international institutions dedicated to justice like the ICC are under attack, I don't know. What do you make of that, Sara?
So one thing I'll note is that there was tremendous support towards a justice mechanism. And I will note that in Rwanda, the need for justice, I think, outweighed the need to identify and locate the rescuers. And these were kind of converging studies and converging efforts during the time when I was there. 2010 through 2014 was kind of the bulk of my doctoral work. And you saw with the Gacaca courts wrapping up, around the same time was also the Ibuka study. The Ibuka study might have actually happened a little bit sooner. It might be over a decade old now. But I will note that it wasn't that there was necessarily opposition, it's just that funding ran out. It wasn't so much because someone was opposed or an international donor tried to get involved and they said, no, we can't take your resources. The funding simply ran out and the interest wasn't there. I think that an organization like Ibuka would be happy to revisit this study and initiate something even larger with resources. But I also do appreciate that, particularly in Rwanda, they are quite, they have their own robust research capabilities. And so the study could predominantly take place in Rwanda and be conducted by Rwandans. You just need to find the resources. I think that we will be having many more discussions about international prosecutions and extradition and the like, with Kabuga's case now possibly staying in The Hague versus making its way to Rwanda, even though Rwanda would like to have him extradited. So stay tuned. I think you'll have a lot more to say on this topic in the coming months.
So
Thank you very much.
There are lots of questions. I'll try to put 2 or 3 together. The one is from Merivik Moll, and she is asking, did you get to explore the role of women in the post-genocide after when the RPF arrived in the country, of the revenge violence that has not been spoken of openly? Mm-hmm. So that is the one question. Another question is, from Lorian Kadigwa, congratulating you for your impressive research and asking, why do you think that women rescuers deserve a particular recognition? Mm-hmm. Do they have more characteristic? Is there something about courage of women? Is there a difference between women and men's rescue efforts that you can highlight? And then maybe just a short one from Lee Boyskin. How is the genocide history dealt with in Rwanda, in schools, universities, the media, and so on? And she's also wanted to know about the orphans. What is happening with genocide orphans so many years later?
Oh my gosh, these are great questions. These are really wonderful. Thank you. Oh my goodness. Okay, so the role of, so I conducted interviews with women leaders in Rwanda post-genocide, a number of heads of ministries, Rose Kabuye, for example, Aloysia Nyumba, several heads of large organizations as part of a study that I did for IDEA out of Stockholm. And that was for actually a piece that was hoping to influence EU policy in post-genocide reconstruction rehabilitation. And my whole argument was listen to the women and examine women both as agents for positive change, but also agents of possible detrimental change as well. In those interviews, I did broach the topic of revenge violence and also coming together, and reconciliation was a key component. I did not hear any narratives about revenge violence. In fact, that was largely rejected, and a number of the women focused instead on this inter-ethnic collaboration that happened between Hutu women leaders and Tutsi women leaders. You have to remember the estimates after the genocide, the estimate was that between 60 and 70% of the adult population in Rwanda was women. And so they were able to, there was a vacuum into which women had to step up as leaders, as heads of households, as elected officials in ways that they had not before. Necessity really catalyzed some of this change. Overall, I heard narratives of them being the agents of positive change versus negative. And that also includes women who, many of the women perpetrators, some who did flee to the Congo, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, though, I will note, joined there were a number of rebel groups that formed out of the refugee camps that were formed there, but one in particular, the FDLR. I did interview 4 women, former combatants who had fought with the FDLR, and they talked about how they continued the violence and the discrimination, anti-Tutsi discrimination, into the DRC. And that's sort of separate from and a bit off tangent, but one of these days I'll get around to pursuing that study a little bit further. But overall, I did not hear those narratives. Why recognize women rescuers in particular? This is such a great question. I think that the narratives that we have, and it's not just from Rwanda, but it's also from the Holocaust and from Cambodia and from Bosnia, we are filled to the brim with cautionary tales of people whom we should not become, and what can happen to society or marginalized groups if evil and dehumanizing rhetoric and us versus them is allowed to get a foothold and eventually become the narrative, the predominant narrative. We don't have as many role models, people whom we could and should become, individuals that we can emulate. And one of the reasons I was so drawn to the women rescuers in particular was their marginalized status in society, the fact that they were second-class citizens, the fact that they were relatively powerless as compared to men. And they still, at great risk to themselves, and often with very violent repercussions. I don't get into it here, but many of these women were beaten or sexually violated or suffered long-term during the genocide and after the genocide because of their acts of heroism. They still went and rescued. They still made that choice. And I think that they are such an inspiring narrative when we're thinking about today's youth, and someday they will be tomorrow's leaders. We need to give them these narratives, not just the cautionary tales, but also the positive role models, the people that they could emulate. And I'm all about representation. And so I want the young girls in the classrooms to also see women who did great acts of heroism just by making a choice to save their friend. So that's a very short answer, but thank you for that question. I could probably talk all day about that one. How is the history of the genocide being taught in Rwanda and portrayed in the media? It's evolving. A lot of it is very much testimony based. And so if you were to go to Rwanda during the 100 days that constitute the commemorative period, so this really starts with April 7th and it runs all the way until Kwibohora, which is their Independence Day on July 4th. And even there, we like to think of it as a neat package, right? It began and ended on these neat dates. It's not entirely the case, but generally the commemorative period, those 100 days, is a really interesting time where on a national level, that first week, there are a lot of national programs and a lot of people speak and survivors give testimony, and there are videos and there are educational programs, and the media is pretty much swallowed whole by it. And after that, it becomes decidedly more local. And so where various instances and various massacres or particular crimes occurred or acts of rescue occurred, you start to see local commemorations happening throughout that 100-day period based on when they occurred in the history of the genocide. This is known as the fastest genocide in modern history. The media plays a very big role in covering it, but there also are some limitations, kind of safeguards that are placed on what they cover. So, for example, you will not see many stories of very graphic sexual violence, even though upwards of 500,000 women were systematically raped during the genocide. And it is actually now systematic rape is part of the definition of genocide. And that's in large part because of the crimes that were perpetrated in Rwanda, but you don't see that being depicted as much because they have found that it is particularly triggering. And for me, looking through a gender lens at this history, that for me is an interesting data point in a way. So you won't see that as much, but also in the curriculum, Rwanda has done a pretty phenomenal job of integrating the history of the genocide and also its pre-colonial roots. They don't just start their history with colonization. They really dig deep and they talk about the existing kingdom that was highly organized with soap opera levels of intrigue and a court, and it's just a really fascinating. They cover all of that in the history and the curriculum. And they've also partnered with outside organizations, for example, USC Shoah Foundation, in the construction of some of that curriculum and the dissemination of resources that are in Kinyarwanda and in English. And so I would say that on the whole, they've been doing a pretty remarkable job of teaching that history.
Thank you so much. We do a little bit of our part. The 3 centers in South Africa are partnering with Aegis Trust and the Kigali Genocide Memorial, and we do quite a lot of youth training and train the trainer of teachers in a program called the Change Makers program that you know, teaches also the genocide against the Tutsi. So a little part, but playing our part. There are
No, actually, Tali, I'm so glad you said that, because I'm remiss. I'm so sorry I forgot that. It's more than a little part. It's massive, because you're educating the educators who then go on and handle some of the very sensitive questions and issues and intergenerational challenges that the youth are facing. And so it's a huge role. I'm so glad you mentioned that.
Thank you, thank you. There are few other questions. Muzamil is asking two quick questions. The one is, are people that are talking to you, are they talking to you as Tutsi Hutu or as Rwandans? And you know, what is the definition that they define themselves when they speak to you? Seeing that Rwanda has such a big number of women participating, as you shared with us, is there a formula to, is everyone Rwandans, or is there a formula, we're going to do 20% that, 30% Twa, 5% who, you know, and so on. So that is the one question. Shirley Sapa is asking about the gachacha, and she asked if women victims felt intimidated to come forward, specifically to look at the attackers or perpetrators, you know, face on. And maybe the last quick question that we can take is from Mokesh Morar, and just asking about the neighboring countries. Did they take note of women majority government in Rwanda? Are they implementing some of it? Do they look at it? Is it a role model for the area?
Those are all great questions. Oh, okay. First of all, so in my interviews, so the use of the terms Tutsi and Hutu in Rwanda are highly charged, and it is now illegal to use them for political purposes or to sow division in Rwanda. That said, when I was interviewing these individuals, they were quite frank about the fact that they were a victim because they were, for the most part, Tutsi, or from a mixed parentage. In Rwanda, after the Belgians colonized Rwanda, they instituted a very fixed sense of ethnic identity, and they assigned it according to patrilineal descent, so it descended from the father down. And so for some of the victims that survivors that I spoke with, they were survivors because their father had been a Tutsi, even if their mother was a Hutu, there was some, they would be targeted as such. So they were quite frank about Hutu, Tutsi, and identifying themselves as such, because that was one of the reasons that I was interviewing them. That said, Rwanda has gone on a massive branding campaign around this idea of Ndi Munyarwanda, I am Rwandan, and getting rid of ethnic markers for identity and going back to a, they argue a pre-colonial identification for Rwandans, although it's a little problematic because those distinctions did occur even if they were socioeconomically based or based on your access to the nexus of power in Rwanda, but still they are working very hard to eliminate those ethnic barriers or identity markers as barriers to feeling that you are part of the Rwandan whole. And so they've worked very hard on that. And so generally in everyday discourse, you're not going to hear those terms. You'll hear people talking about Rwandans, especially the youth have really, many of them have embraced this idea of moving forward with a joint identity and nation-based identity, a very proud identity. But with the research that I was doing, just by virtue of the people I was meeting and the history that I was telling, that we were unpacking, this came out, their ethnic identity. They do not do a census at this point that designates according to ethnic identity, and so we do not know the numbers anymore. And even the numbers that we had, the pre-genocide numbers are often, 14% Twa, 84% Hutu, 1 to 1.5% Twa. I'm sorry, Tutsi, Hutu, Twa. Even those were highly politicized and problematic, and some argue inaccurate. And so I don't know that we'll ever have a full sense of what was the composition, the ethnic composition of Rwanda, but at this point, it's considered irrelevant by the leadership and by many of the members of the society. Women victims who were intimidated to come forward during Gachacha. This is actually a really interesting point, because I should note that I, years ago, served as a witness. I wrote affidavits in support of several Rwandan women who fled to the United States and sought asylum because of the Gachacha process. So as incredible as the Gachacha initiative was for establishing this national record and trying so many suspected individuals of genocide, 1,003,227 individuals, and over 1.9 million cases or crimes of genocide. So some people had perpetrated or were suspected of perpetrating multiple crimes. Even with those tremendous numbers and the heroic effort it entailed, there was great instability, especially for women and women who had been victims of sexual violence, or women who were the sole survivors in their family and therefore did not have a family around them to protect them. And so I wrote a number of affidavits describing that, the precariousness of their situation, even with all of the advances Rwanda has made, but acknowledging that they were a particularly marginalized and vulnerable group within Rwandan society. In terms of where Rwanda is now, it has become a benchmark for success when it comes to gender mainstreaming. And I will note that several of the governments around Rwanda, including Burundi and Uganda, where Burundi is considered almost like a cousin state to Rwanda and Uganda, there is this ongoing friendly-ish rivalry that they have all also instituted certain changes in their constitution to guarantee that 30% benchmark of women in appointed ministerial positions, for example. And so Rwanda has become, in a way, a benchmark for gender mainstreaming success in Central and Eastern Africa. But also, I mean, here in the United States, I'll say that they're also a role model for us because we have a huge way to go.
Wow, marathon, last two, and we will close. So Priscilla is asking, what about those who immigrated to neighboring countries and are descendants of Rwanda and maybe with different cultures and are afraid to return back home because of those biases? Have you done any research on this or came across this during your research? And then just one last comment from Karen Vicency saying, we also have our adult orphans asylum seekers in South Africa still carrying the vivid trauma of the violence and losses, and this made worse by xenophobic experiences here and also at the, because of the current COVID-19 lockdown. And to maybe reference a little bit to those that immigrated to other countries in Africa and are targeted still. Shamefully in South Africa, it is happening for over 12 years.
Those are such good points. I'll admit this is not an area that I am so well versed in. I have done some work with the diaspora community here in the United States, and I can say that raising your children outside of Rwanda, or children orphans who sought asylum, growing up in a society that is not your own, you're of course you're going to assimilate a bit, or I actually prefer the term acculturate, meaning that you hold on to what you can from your prior culture, but you also adopt from your newer culture. And of course it's going to change you. I've noticed that even with all of the efforts, especially around Kwibuka 20, which was the 20th commemoration of the genocide against the Tutsi back in 2014, there were tremendous efforts to engage the diaspora population because there had been such a disconnect, and because so many of them felt that even though they were outside of Rwanda, they still wanted to be able to commemorate the genocide that they had experienced. And efforts have been made harnessing social media platforms and virtual platforms that exist. Harnessing those platforms has actually been quite successful. So I'll note that I'm participating, for example, via Zoom next Saturday in a Kwibuka 26 program that's happening in Southern California. And there's an entire association of survivors based out of Southern California who put this on every single year. But it is hard to go back to your home country after that. And for some, it's actually quite triggering and can lead to episodes of post-traumatic stress and psychosis. And it's just deep trauma. I would also note that I think across the board, my center, we've been doing wellness checks with our local survivor population to make sure that everyone's okay during COVID-19 and as we socially isolate. And one of the things that I noted, I was speaking to one of our child survivors from Rwanda, and this is anecdotal, this is not expert anything, but anecdotally, he was talking about that sense of fear and suspicion and not knowing the people behind masks as he walks through New York City. He connected that, he was talking about that, and it connected me with one of our local Holocaust survivors who was talking to me about the same thing. And it was interesting to note that both of them connected it to their prior experiences, but both also then said to me, but it was much worse back then. We can get through this. And so somehow they were able to make a connection to the social isolation, the fear that is permeating this period of time globally, but to take from it a message of resilience and say, it's been much worse, we can get through this. So I take tremendous hope from that, but I also know that they are highly marginalized, especially when they're facing xenophobia, risk, and conspiracy theories about where the virus originated, and possibly they might be targeted as a result and scapegoated. My heart goes out to that population. I'm so sorry. It's the best we can do is try to take this time, even as we isolate, to forge connections and come together, even if they're solely virtual for now.
Absolutely, absolutely. And you certainly helped us to connect today, and really wonderful, wonderful talk, wonderful conversation with everyone. You will check the chat and see so many thank yous from all around the world, also from our partners from the Durban Holocaust and Genocide Center and Cape Town Holocaust and Genocide Center, as well as many, many others. And I really do thank you in your morning, our late afternoon, for joining us and teaching us something about woman agency in this 100 days of memory. I call on everyone to download the book and learn more about all the examples, free of charge. And Sara, it was great. We hope that one day we can host you in South Africa, in person, maybe in a year or two when things are calming down. And from all our team at the Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, Kath, Jordan, Dowie, Delka, and everyone else, thank you so much and have a great, great day.
Thank you. Thank you so, so much for hosting me, and just what a wonderful center you have. I'm in awe. Tali, I've been your fan for years, so I'm just so thrilled to now you have a friend and a collaborator in change. So anytime, please come across the pond, I'll come to you. But thank you so much. This is so important. Thank you.
Wonderful. Have a lovely, lovely evening, everyone. Afternoon, morning. See you again soon. Bye-bye.